March 13th, 1951. The federal courthouse at Foley Square in Lower Manhattan. A third-floor courtroom packed beyond capacity. Spectators have been standing in line since before dawn, and the hallways are shoulder to shoulder with reporters, photographers, and anyone who could talk their way past the marshals. Inside, television cameras from 5 of New York City's 7 stations are aimed at a long wooden table where a man in a dark suit is taking a seat. His name is Frank Costello. He is 60 years old. He controls the Luciano crime family. He holds the political allegiance of Tammany Hall, has placed at least one sitting judge on the New York Supreme Court, and according to Treasury agents who have tracked him for 2 decades, operates a criminal empire generating tens of millions of dollars annually through gambling, slot machines, and political protection. Until 3 weeks ago, most Americans had never heard his name. His attorney, George Wolfe, rises before the proceedings begin and addresses the committee chairman, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. Wolfe's objection is specific. His client is willing to testify, but he will not submit himself as a spectacle. He will not allow his face to be broadcast on live television, the 5 senators confer. Kefauver agrees to a compromise. The television cameras will be redirected. They will show only Costello's hands, and so 30 million Americans watch a pair of hands. They watch the fingers roll a small ball of paper between thumb and forefinger. They watch the palms press flat against the table, then separate, then press down again. They watch the hands reach for a glass of water, grip it, set it down without drinking. They watch the fingers tear a strip of paper into smaller and smaller pieces, while the raspy voice above them, a voice thick with East Harlem, answers questions about slot machines, racetrack income, and a Scotch whiskey endorsement deal that pays $25,000 a year. Senator Charles Tobey of New Hampshire leans forward and asks the question the audience has been waiting for. What has Costello ever done for his country? The hands freeze. The raspy voice delivers a 2-word answer that will be quoted in every newspaper from coast to coast: paid my tax. When Hallie asks about the $40,000 to $50,000 in cash Costello keeps in a strongbox at his apartment, Costello admits it casually. I believe I had a little strongbox. I keep $40,000, $50,000. He testifies that he earns $18,000 a year from the Beverly Country Club in New Orleans as a goodwill man who recommends entertainment acts, $15,000 from a Long Island racetrack for doing what he calls practically nothing, and $25,000 for promoting a Scotch whiskey brand by drinking it in Manhattan saloons. The numbers add up to a comfortable living. They don't add up to the Central Park West penthouse, the political machine, or the strongbox. The New York Times calls the footage video's first ballet of the hands. Newsday observes that the hands are more character-revealing than his expressionless face would have been. Across the country, the response is without precedent. Brooklyn movie theaters screen the feed from WPIX free of charge. A blood bank in Brooklyn installs a television tuned to the hearings, and donations double overnight. Department stores empty. Broadway box offices report their worst midweek numbers in years. A New York Times critic writes that the city is under a hypnotic spell. Life magazine will later describe the week of March 12th as a moment when people simply went indoors, into living rooms, taverns, club rooms, and back offices, and sat in eerie half-light watching millions of small, frosty screens as if charmed. The hands belonged to a man who had spent 3 decades making sure nobody knew his face. He didn't carry a gun. He didn't order hits in public. He didn't attend the famous gangland conferences. His power was the kind that leaves no photographs. A phone call to a district leader, a handshake with a judge at a charity dinner, an envelope passed at a political clubhouse. For 30 years, that architecture of invisibility had held. And then, a freshman senator from Tennessee pointed a television camera at it, and the whole country watched the architecture shake. What almost nobody understood, not the 30 million viewers, not the newspaper editorials that followed, not even Kefauver himself, was that watching wouldn't be enough. The mainstream version of the Kefauver hearings is a story about exposure. A brave senator drags the Mafia into the light. America sees organized crime for the first time, and the government begins its long march toward accountability. It's a tidy narrative, and it's wrong in the place that matters most. The hearings didn't expose the Mafia. They exposed the political protection apparatus that made the Mafia possible. They showed 30 million people the specific mechanics of how organized crime purchased immunity from the American government. And then the government, the same one that had just put on the show, failed almost entirely to act on what the country had seen. The committee's direct institutional impact was, in the United States Senate Historical Office's own assessment, modest at best. The FBI director spent the next 6 years continuing to deny organized crime existed. The legal tool needed to prosecute a criminal organization as an organization wouldn't be enacted for another 2 decades. The famous story ends with the cameras. The real story is about everything that didn't happen after they turned off. The investigation existed because a man was murdered under the wrong photograph. On April 6, 1950, Kansas City political boss Charles Binaggio and his bodyguard Charles Gargotta were found shot to death at the First Ward Democratic Club on Truman Road. The bodies were slumped beneath a large portrait of President Harry Truman. Photographs of the scene, Binaggio in his swivel chair, the president's face beaming above the blood, made every front page in the country. Binaggio had allegedly promised the Kansas City mob that he could deliver an open city, one where gambling and vice operations would run without police interference, in exchange for their support of his political ascent. He had failed to deliver, and the men who had backed him collected the debt in the only currency they understood. But the symbolism of the murder scene was what mattered politically. Truman's own career had been launched by the Kansas City Pendergast machine, the same ecosystem that produced Binaggio. The pressure to act became irresistible. Senator Kefauver had introduced Senate Resolution 202 on January 5, 1950, calling for a federal investigation into organized crime crossing state lines. The proposal had been stalled for months by jurisdictional fights, the Judiciary Committee, and the Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce both wanted control. When the vote finally came on May 3, 1950, the Senate deadlocked. Vice President Alban Barkley cast the tie-breaking vote. The committee was created with a budget of $150,000. 5 senators served, Kefauver as chairman, Herbert O'Connor of Maryland, Lester Hunt of Wyoming, Charles Tobey of New Hampshire, and Alexander Wiley of Wisconsin. The chief counsel was Rudolph Halley, a relentless questioner who became nearly as famous as Kefauver. The committee was authorized until March 31, 1951, extended twice, and finally dissolved on September 1st of that year. It held hearings in 14 cities, heard more than 600 witnesses, and published 21 volumes of testimony. Kefauver's motivations weren't purely civic. Washington Post publisher Phil Graham reportedly told the senator directly, "Yestis, don't you want to be vice president?" And Kefauver understood that a nationally visible investigation could make him a presidential contender. It did. By December of 1951, Americans ranked him among the 10 most admired men in the country. He won the New Hampshire primary against Truman himself, and Truman, who privately called Kefauver a demagogic dumbbell, withdrew from the race. The ambition and the reform impulse weren't contradictions, they were the same fuel. But the committee's most damaging findings weren't about individual gangsters. They were about the machine those gangsters had built to neutralize the government itself. Costello's political operation functioned with the precision of a legitimate business, except it purchased people instead of products. Born Francesco Castiglia in Calabria, he had arrived in East Harlem at age 4, led the 104th Street gang as a teenager, and done a year in prison for carrying a concealed weapon in 1915. Afterward, he made a vow that distinguished him from every other boss in New York. He would never carry a gun again. The vow was held for 60 years. Violence was inefficient. What Costello mastered was influence. He inherited Arnold Rothstein's connections to Tammany Hall and systematically expanded them. By the early 1940s, he could place judges on the bench. The proof came from a wiretap that Manhattan District Attorney Frank Hogan recorded in 1943. Thomas Aurelio, who had just received both the Democratic and Republican nominations for New York Supreme Court, telephoned Costello the morning after the nomination was secured. Aurelio's words captured on the wire. "Good morning, Francesco. How are you? And thanks for everything." Costello: "Congratulations. It went over perfectly. When I tell you something's in the bag, you can rest assured." Aurelio: "Right now, I want to assure you of my loyalty for all you have done. It's undying." Despite the scandal that followed, Aurelio won the election by roughly 50,000 votes. Costello's lawyer later noted that Costello also held a $7,500 promissory note with Aurelio's signature on it. The revenue that funded this apparatus came primarily through two channels. The first was gambling, specifically the Continental Press Service, which held a near monopoly on providing minute-by-minute horse racing results to bookmakers across the country. The mechanics were specific. Spotters positioned at racetracks used mirror signals or telephone relays to flash coded results to a telegrapher. That telegrapher sent the data via Western Union teletype to distribution points across the country. Without this service, bookmakers were vulnerable to post-betting, gamblers with inside connections placing wagers on races that had already been run. Whoever controlled the wire controlled bookmaking. The Capone syndicate seized Continental after murdering the original owner, James Reagan, in 1946, shot in an ambush, then poisoned in his hospital bed before he could testify. Kefauver would later call Continental public enemy number 1. The second channel was Costello's slot machine empire. At its peak, an estimated 25,000 machines operated across the New York area, each requiring systematic payoffs to police, politicians, and district leaders. When Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia personally smashed and dumped the machines in 1934, Costello didn't fight. He relocated the entire operation to Louisiana under a deal with Governor Huey Long, who demanded 10% of the profits. Within a year, more than 1,000 machines were running in New Orleans through the Bayou Novelty Company. In a single year, the Louisiana operation grossed $1,297,580. The money flowed upward through layers of protection. Police captains received a monthly envelope. District leaders took a percentage, and the political machine used the revenue to fund campaigns, reward loyalty, and destroy opposition. Kefauver estimated that organized crime's total annual revenue from illegal gambling alone reached $20 billion, almost as large, he said, as the annual appropriation for defense. And the protection that allowed this economy to function wasn't hidden. In Tampa, the Traficante family used bolita, an illegal numbers lottery, to fund political campaigns directly. Murdered gangster Jimmy Velasco's family released receipts showing he had spent $28,000 on the 1947 Tampa election alone. In Chicago, Police Captain Dan Gilbert, known as the richest cop in the world, admitted before the committee to making thousands of dollars gambling on sports and elections, destroying his bid for Cook County Sheriff. Florida Governor Fuller Warren had received approximately $100,000 in campaign funds from a dog track owner connected to the Capone organization. In New York, a 1950 corruption scandal led to the resignation of hundreds of NYPD officers and the replacement of all 336 members of the plainclothes division. The protection apparatus wasn't a secret the committee uncovered. It was a structure so deeply embedded in American municipal governance that exposing it was easier than removing it. The television dimension of the hearings was an accident that became a revolution. In 1950, only about 9% of American households owned a television set, roughly 5 million units nationwide. By early 1951, that number had surged past 12 million, and the Kefauver hearings themselves were accelerating the adoption. Daytime schedules were largely empty. Advertisers hadn't figured out what to do with the morning and afternoon hours, when 5 of New York's 7 stations decided to carry the Foley Square hearings live beginning March 12th. Nobody in broadcasting expected what followed. The signal was transmitted via coaxial cable to stations in approximately 20 cities across the East and Midwest. Time magazine helped sponsor the broadcasts, promoting subscriptions during commercial breaks. The audience reached an estimated 30 million viewers. In Detroit, 9 out of 10 television sets were tuned in. The cultural response bordered on collective paralysis. Time reported that dishes stood in sinks, babies went unfed, business sagged, and department stores emptied. Jack Gould, the New York Times television critic, wrote that the city had been under a hypnotic spell, absorbed, fascinated, angered, and amused, and called it a rare community experience. A Daily News columnist wrapped it up. Take an old Joe Louis fight, a World Series game, and an Army Notre Dame clash. Bundle them into one entertainment package, and you've got the Kefauver thriller. Schools dismiss students early. Kefauver block parties formed across the metropolitan area. Broadway attendance withered. Bars in St. Louis did more business during the hearings than during the World Series broadcast 3 months earlier. Broadcasting Magazine declared that television had changed overnight from everybody's whipping boy to a public benefactor. Kefauver won an Emmy Award in 1952 for Outstanding Public Service on Television, the first politician to receive one. His book, Crime in America, co-written with Sidney Chalette, became a bestseller serialized in over 100 newspapers. The structural contrast buried inside this spectacle was the real story. While 30 million civilians were discovering organized crime through their television sets, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the agency theoretically responsible for fighting it, had arranged its resources to ensure that organized crime remained unfought. In the FBI's new York field office, 400 agents were assigned to hunting subversives. 4 agents, 4 were tracking organized crime. J. Edgar Hoover had spent decades publicly denying that a national crime syndicate existed. His reasons were practical, not ideological. Organized crime investigations required enormous resources. The potential for agent corruption was high, and the Mafia's financial and political connections made it a dangerous adversary. Better to chase communists who had no lobbyists and couldn't place your agents on their payroll. Standing in direct opposition to Hoover was Harry Anslinger, commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger had spent years building intelligence files on approximately 800 individuals with suspected ties to the Mafia and narcotics trafficking. He told investigators that there were only 3 of us in law enforcement who believed in the Mafia in those days. His agents testified before the committee that organized crime smuggled enough narcotics to supply a fifth of America's addict population. The committee largely accepted Anslinger's assertions, and the contrast was damning. One federal agency maintained detailed files on 800 suspected Mafia associates. The other denied those associates were organized at all. The individual witnesses gave the hearings their dramatic texture, but each of them, knowingly or not, was demonstrating a different face of the system's dysfunction. Virginia Hill appeared on March 16, 1951, wearing a $5,000 mink cape and a broad-brimmed hat. Born Oni Virginia Hill in Lipscomb, Alabama, she had served as a courier and bagwoman for the Chicago outfit, carrying cash between cities in the years before electronic transfers made the job obsolete. She was also Bugsy Siegel's lover. She had left for Paris 10 days before Siegel was shot to death in her Beverly Hills mansion in June of 1947. Before the Ibixal committee, Hill was evasive and combative. She claimed her money came from winning bets on horses and from gifts men simply gave her. About the mob figures' finances, she said she never knew anything about their business. They didn't tell her, and why would they? About Siegel's Las Vegas operations. I had hay fever. I was allergic to the cactus. After being excused, she slugged and floored a female reporter named Marjorie Farnsworth on the courthouse steps, spewed obscenities at photographers, and before climbing into a cab shouted, "I hope the atom bomb falls on every one of you." The IRS later hit her with a $161,000 tax lien. She fled to Europe and was found dead near Salzburg, Austria on March 24, 1966, an apparent overdose of sleeping pills. She was 49. Willie Moretti was the only major mob witness who cooperated, and that cooperation would cost him everything, a fact that needs to be understood before a single word of his testimony makes sense. Moretti was the underboss of the Genovese family's New Jersey operations, and by 1950, advanced syphilis had eroded his judgment to the point where other bosses considered him a security risk. What he said before the committee couldn't hurt him any more than the disease already had. When he testified on December 12th and 13th of 1950, he was jovial, sharp, and genuinely funny. Asked about Mafia membership, he quipped, "What do you mean? Like, do I carry a membership card that says Mafia on it?" About his associates, well-charactered people don't need introductions. His parting words to the senators, "Don't forget my home and deal. If you are down the shore, you are invited." Senator Tobey called his frankness rather refreshing. 7 months later, on October 4th, 1951, Moretti sat down with 3 or 4 men at Joe's Elbow Room restaurant in Cliffside Park, New Jersey. An Italian waitress remembered them joking in Italian. When she went to the kitchen, she heard gunshots. Moretti was found dead with bullet wounds to his face and head, shot from the front, reportedly a mark of respect. Vito Genovese had lobbied for the killing, calling it a mercy. The committee's most entertaining witness was dead because he had been entertaining. William O'Dwyer, the former New York City mayor who had been appointed an ambassador to Mexico, an appointment widely seen as Truman, removing him from the reach of a Brooklyn grand jury. testified on March 19th and 20th. As Brooklyn District Attorney, O'Dwyer had prosecuted Murder, Inc., using star witness Abe Rels. On November 12, 1941, Relis fell or was thrown from the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island the morning he was scheduled to testify against Albert Anastasia. The case collapsed. O'Dwyer's line about it became famous. When Relis went out the window, the case went out the window with him. The committee revealed that O'Dwyer had visited Costello's Manhattan apartment in 1942. His response, "Nothing embarrasses me that happens in Manhattan," captured the culture of impunity that the hearings exposed but couldn't cure. And then Costello walked out. On March 15th, after 2 days of testimony that had made his hands the most watched body part in America, he told the committee he had a sore throat. His attorney produced a doctor's note. The exchange that followed was broadcast live. "Am I under arrest? No. Then I am walking out." Kefauver asked if he was refusing to testify further. Absolutely. He left. The most powerful criminal in the country had just demonstrated on camera the precise limit of what a Senate investigation could do. It could be asked. It could not be compelling. And when the asking got uncomfortable, the witness could simply stand up and leave. The committee filed 11 contempt charges at a second trial. The first ended in a deadlocked jury. Costello was convicted on 10 of 11 counts and sentenced to 18 months and a $5,000 fine. He served approximately 14 months at the Federal Correctional Institution in Milan, Michigan. Subsequently convicted of tax evasion on $51,095 in unreported income, he received 5 years and served 42 months. These were the committee's most significant criminal results. Not against the organization, not against the system, but against one man, for refusing to talk and for lying about his taxes. The committee had recommended 22 federal actions. What Congress actually passed could be listed on an index card. The Johnson Act prohibited interstate shipment of slot machines to states where they were illegal. The Revenue Act of 1951 imposed a 10% excise tax on gambling receipts and a $50 annual gambling stamp. By December 1st of that year, only 7,700 mob gamblers had registered in a country where Kefauver estimated $20 billion moved through illegal betting annually. Congress expanded narcotics appropriations to hire 30 additional agents. That was essentially the full legislative output of the most watched government proceeding in American history. The committee's flagship recommendation, a permanent federal crime commission with investigative authority, was actively destroyed. Hoover lobbied against it. The Department of Justice opposed it. The wire service regulation bill that Kefauver had championed as urgent sat untouched in Congress for a full decade, not passing until Robert F. Kennedy pushed it through as the Federal Wire Act of 1961. The immunity statute the committee desperately needed. Kefauver said the committee was deprived of much useful and relevant information without the power to grant witnesses immunity from prosecution was never enacted. The structural reason for the failure was built into the system itself. A Senate committee could investigate, but it could not prosecute. It had no law enforcement powers, and the legal framework to attack a criminal organization as an organization rather than as a collection of individuals committing individual crimes did not exist. The Mafia adapted faster than the government did. Bosses who had appeared on television learned a single lesson: stay invisible. The organization closed its membership books. Operations shifted to cities and territories where the committee hadn't reached. In Las Vegas, mob investment actually grew. Criminals displaced from other cities surged into Nevada, and by the early 1960s, organized crime's stake in the city reached an estimated $300 million. In New York, 505 NYPD members applied for early retirement to avoid the disclosure requirements the committee had triggered, a mass exodus of officers who apparently preferred losing their pensions to explaining their finances. The committee that was supposed to begin the destruction of organized crime had, in some territories, accelerated its expansion. Joe Adonis, born Giuseppe Antonio Dotto, was convicted of illegal gambling, sentenced to 2 to 3 years, then discovered to be an illegal alien and deported to Italy in January of 1956. Carlos Marcello, who had pleaded the Fifth 152 times during his January 1951 appearance in New Orleans, returned to his empire and ran it for another 3 decades. Jake Guzik, the Chicago outfit's financial wizard who wore dark glasses before the committee and offered the memorable malapropism that his answers might discriminate against him, died of a heart attack in 1956 in his bed, unprosecuted. On May 2, 1957, Vincent Giganti, acting on Vito Genovese's orders, shot Costello in the lobby of his apartment building at 115 Central Park West. The bullet grazed his skull. Costello survived, retired from active mob leadership, and died of a heart attack on February 18, 1973. He was 82. The man whose hands 30 million Americans had watched on television lived another 22 years after the hearings, and the system he built outlived him. The gap between what 30 million Americans saw and what their government did about it, that's the structural question the Kefauver hearings force you to sit with. If full public exposure of a criminal system broadcast on live television into millions of homes can't produce institutional change, what can? And if the answer is that exposure only works when the legal architecture exists to act on it, then who bears responsibility for the 20 years the country spent without those tools? The 20 years between the hearing room at Foley Square and the passage of RICO. Tell me what you think in the comments. If you're still with me on this one, a subscribe would mean a lot. The institutional chain that finally closed the gap took 2 decades and 4 separate catalysts. On November 14, 1957, New York State Police raided a private estate in Appalachian, a small town in the southern tier, where approximately 100 Mafia leaders from across the country had gathered for a national summit. The raid, triggered by a local sergeant named Edgar Croswell, who had noticed an unusual number of expensive cars with out-of-state plates arriving at the estate of a local bottling company owner named Joseph Barbara, accomplished in one afternoon what the Kefauver Committee had failed to achieve in 15 months. Dozens of men in silk suits were found fleeing through the woods, many carrying thousands of dollars in cash. It was undeniable, physical proof of a national criminal organization, the kind of proof that a Senate hearing couldn't produce. Within days, Hoover established the Top Hoodlum Program, dedicating FBI resources to organized crime for the first time. But even Appalachian produced limited convictions. Nearly all were overturned on appeal. Kefauver himself didn't live to see the chain completed. He won the Democratic vice presidential nomination in 1956, running alongside Adlai Stevenson in their loss to Eisenhower. He continued serving in the Senate, chairing investigations into pharmaceutical pricing and antitrust violations. On August 10, 1963, he suffered a heart attack on the Senate floor and died later that day at Bethesda Naval Hospital. He was 60. The McClellan Committee hearings of 1957 through 1960, with Robert Kennedy as chief counsel, built explicitly on Kefauver's groundwork. A reporter had told Kennedy that probing organized crime made a name for Senator Kefauver, and Kennedy pushed further, targeting labor racketeering and pursuing Jimmy Hoffa and Dave Beck through 300 days of public hearings and 1,500 witnesses. In 1963, Joe Valachi became the first Mafia insider to publicly describe the organization's internal structure, naming it La Cosa Nostra, a name Hoover immediately adopted because it allowed him to acknowledge the syndicate without using the word mafia, which he had spent decades denying existed. As Attorney General, Kennedy pushed through the Wire Act that Kefauver had recommended a decade earlier. The breakthrough came in 1970 with RICO, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, enacted as Title IX of the Organized Crime Control Act. For the first time, prosecutors could charge a criminal enterprise as an enterprise, targeting the organizational structure rather than individual crimes. The law was directly traceable to the Kefauver Committee's recommendation that civil law be expanded to combat organized crime, when President Reagan signed an executive order to strengthening RICO enforcement in 1983. He explicitly linked the lineage. Few weapons against organized crime have proven more effective or more important, he said, than the investigations of the Kefauver Committee in the early 50s. 20 years from diagnosis to cure. 20 years in which the organization that 30 million people watched exposed on live television continued to operate, adapt, and, in some cases, grow. If understanding the 20-year gap between America seeing organized crime and America finally having the tools to fight it is the kind of thing you came here for, a like tells me to keep going. There is a building at 300 Stewart Avenue in Las Vegas, Nevada. It is a former federal courthouse built in 1933 in the neoclassical style. Limestone columns, high ceilings, a second-floor courtroom with the original judge's bench still intact. On November 15, 1950, Estes Kefauver sat in that courtroom and questioned witnesses about organized crime's infiltration of the Las Vegas casino industry. It was one of 14 stops on his committee's national tour. The building was supposed to represent the power of the federal government to confront what it found. Today, it is the Mob Museum. Visitors buy tickets at the front desk, walk upstairs, and sit in the same courtroom where senators once questioned gangsters. The hearing room has been preserved, the bench, the witness table, the gallery seating. Tourists take photographs. The building that housed the government's attempt to expose organized crime has become, quite literally, a museum exhibit about organized crime. Nobody changed the room. They just changed the sign on the door.